in the likeness of man, for them the Most High and Eternal cannot be portrayed by human hands and will never pass away. For this reason, they erect no images in their cities, still less in their temples. Their kings are not so flattered, the Roman emperors not so honored. However, their priests used to perform their chants of the flute and drums, crowned with ivy and a golden vine, was discovered in the temple, and this has led some to imagine that the god thus worshipped was Prince Liber, the conqueror of the East. But the two cults are diametrically opposed. Liber found a festive and happy cult. The Jewish belief is paradoxical and degraded. Well, I'm sure in Jewish studies you can find a wealth of information showing anti-Semitism was alive and well in the ancient world, as we saw by Tacitus. He's questioning the origins of Jewish theology, thinking that it was something that glommed onto other belief systems, whether those from the East could be Persian beliefs or Zoroastrianism, or Egyptian beliefs or Roman religion. He seems to not like the Jewish people for not offering due deference and respect to the emperor, which by the 1st and 2nd centuries is really approaching something of worship of the emperor, especially after the period of Caligula, where he openly welcomed it. Now, let's back up a little bit and look at what some contemporary scholars think of as the origins of the Jewish people. What are alternate theories of those who look at the Old Testament from a critical perspective? Now, before I get into this, I should mention that historians of the ancient world will be, for the most part, well familiar with the Old Testament. Even those who think all the supernatural elements and the religious elements are not true will realize that this is a document that can comment a lot about what's happening politically in the Near East. Some think that the dates in which it is written is much later than the traditional view, which says it was written by Moses in 1300s BC. Instead, they would say that it came from the 6th or 5th centuries BC, and there might be fragments that are older in the 9th century, and it was assembled together and cobbled together, and there's some rough edges here or there that make it very difficult to assign with definition when different parts were read. Whatever the case, historians of the ancient world will say that this is an indispensable source. So no one is completely rejecting the Old Testament for the most part, but the questions about the origins of the Jewish people are heavily contested. So let's look at some contemporary scholarly ideas. The first extant reference we have to Israel that comes out of the Old Testament appears in the Merneptah stele, which dates back to 1209 BC. And it says this is coming from Egypt: Israel is laid waste, and his seed is no more. Okay, so according to this stele, this monument, what is Israel? Well, it's considered a cultural and political entity, and it's established well enough that Egyptians consider it worthy to track and maybe even consider it a possible challenge. But maybe it's not considered a state in the traditional sense, but an ethnic group. Paula McNutt, an archaeologist, says, it's probably during the Iron Age that a population began to identify itself as Israelite, differentiating itself from its neighbors via prohibitions on intermarriage, an emphasis on family history and genealogy and religion. Now, we have very little in the way of texts or monuments or plaques to go by, but we have a lot of archaeology in this period because there's been centuries of sustained interest in Israel because so many of the forefounders of archaeology also believed in some form of historical Christianity and thought it was worth digging up. They found that in the late Bronze Age, there were no more than about 25 villages in the highlands, in the historical homeland of Israel. But by the end of the Iron Age, this increased to over 300, while the settled population doubled from 20,000 to 40,000. The villages were more numerous and larger in the north, and probably shared the highlands with pastoral nomads. Archaeologists and historians have tried to trace the origins of these villages, and they haven't been able to identify any distinctive features that they could show as being specifically Israelite, with specific ornamentation or something that really stands out from other civilizations or cultures nearby. A popular theory of the origin of the Israelites is summed up in a book that's well known by archaeologists of the Near East called The Bible on Earth, released in 2001, written by Finkelstein and Silberman. Their theory is that the Israelite ethnic identity didn't come from the Exodus, from which we really don't have a lot of archaeological evidence that hundreds of thousands of people went from Egypt to the Promised Land and the subsequent conquest, but from a transformation from the existing Canaanite Philistine cultures that were already there. They note that intensive land surveys at the end of the 20th century show the traditional territories of the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, and they show the emergence of a new culture that contrasted with the Philistine and Canaanite societies during the Iron Age. This new culture was characterized by a lack of pork remains. You couldn't find skeletons of pigs like you could other animals, showing people didn't eat pork. There's an abandonment of the Philistine Canaanite custom of having highly decorated pottery and the practice of circumcision. So this discovery of the remains of a dense network of highland villages that appear to be established within a few generations indicate that a dramatic social transformation took place in the hill country of Canaan around 1200 BC. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. It doesn't seem to be an invasion or the appearance of an outside ethnic group, but it was just a change in lifestyle of the people who are already there. In the formerly sparsely populated highlands from the Judean hills in the south to the hills of Samaria in the north, there were cities that sprung up, and they argue that these were the first Israelites. Now, when we get further into the Iron Age, from about 1000 to about 600 BC, we start to see Israel appear in more outside sources. In the 10th century BC, an inscription on the Egyptian pharaoh, Sheshenq I, he records a series of campaigns directed at the area. So Israel clearly emerges by the middle of the 9th century BC, when the Assyrian king, Shalmaneser, names Ahab the Israelite among his enemies at the Battle of Karkar in 853. And Ahab is also mentioned in the Old Testament. Israel appears to be engaged in a three-way contest with Damascus and Tyre for control of the Jezreel Valley and Galilee in the north. There's a stele, the Mesha stele, which dates back to 830 BC, left by a king of Moab, which he writes celebrates the success of throwing out the oppression of the house of Omri, or Israel. Omri was another king. So it's thought to be the earliest extra-biblical reference to the name Yahweh. A century later, Israel came into increasing conflict with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which first split Israel's territory into several smaller units and destroyed its capital. Both Assyrian sources and biblical sources talk about a massive deportation of people from Israel and their replacement with settlers from other parts of the empire. This deportation policy wasn't unique to Israel. I talked about ancient Assyria and their collapse in an early hour episode on how climate can wipe out a civilization. And Assyria commonly displaced huge populations because maybe they wanted to populate an area, they wanted to cultivate the farmland there, maybe they wanted to make sure that the people wouldn't rebel. And a good way to make sure that a large population doesn't rebel is to uproot them. They don't have their traditional networks with their neighbors, and they're more dependent on you as an empire. It's a way to break the old power structure. So Israel is recorded in the Bible, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, as never becoming an independent political entity again. Judah emerges later than Israel, probably during the 9th century BC, but where they come from is heavily contested amongst scholars. In the 7th century BC, Jerusalem grew to contain a population much greater than earlier and clearly dominated its neighbors. This occurred at the time that Israel was being destroyed by the new Assyrian Empire. So Judah could have been assigned by the Assyrians vassal status in order for them to control the olive industry. But in the last half of the 7th century, Assyria collapsed, and the ensuing competition between Egypt and the Neo-Babylonian Empire for control of the land led to the destruction of Judah in a series of campaigns between 597 and 582. And the 7th, 6th centuries BC is around the time that the book Unearthing the Bible argues that the Bible itself, or the Old Testament, is written. By that, they mean that there's not archaeological evidence of the migration of a band of Semitic people across the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt to Israel, except for a group called the Hyksos. So the book argues that the Exodus narrative perhaps evolved from vague memories of the Hyksos expulsion, and it was spun to encourage resistance to the 7th century domination of Judah by Egypt. Finkelstein and Silberman argue that instead of the Israelites conquering Canaan after the Exodus, most of them had in fact always been there. The Israelites were just Canaanites who developed into a different culture. When Israel becomes a kingdom, Finkelstein and Silberman also say that the account differs from the Old Testament. In the book of Samuel and parts of the books of Kings that portray Saul, David, and Solomon rule over a united and powerful and cosmopolitan empire of the united Israel and Judah, Finkelstein and Silberman argue that, according to modern archaeology, this might not be true. Instead, in the time of Solomon, the northern kingdom of Israel was small, and it couldn't pay for a vast army. It had a small bureaucracy and couldn't administer a kingdom, definitely not an empire. But instead, they argue that around the beginning of the 9th century BC, in the time of the king of Omri, that's when a kingdom emerges. So there's little to suggest that Jerusalem, which was called David's capital, was more than a typical hill country village during the time of David and Solomon, and Judah wasn't much more than a sparsely populated rural region until the 8th century BC. There is a stele, or a monument called the Tel Dan stele, that confirms that a house of David existed, so there's good evidence that David was a historical figure, and clearly validates the biblical description of a figure named David becoming the founder of the dynasty of the Judaic kingdoms in Jerusalem. It doesn't say anything else about him. So the book The Bible on Earth would say that the pinnacle of power in ancient Israel would be during the Omride kingdoms, or the dynasty of Omri. The Old Testament mentions the Omride kingdoms as marrying foreign women and upholding Canaanite religion, so all in negative terms, which it regards as wicked. So the Bible on Earth concludes the biblical writers deliberately invented the wealth of Saul and David and Solomon. They skip over the Omride kingdoms so they could denigrate them and obscure their accomplishments, because these kings held a different religious viewpoint that was anathema to the biblical editors. The biblical editors are writing in a time when monotheism is much more established. They and other archaeologists note that Israel changes after the Assyrian Empire conquers them. Jerusalem expands by about 15-fold, turning it from a small hill town to a large city, and other small Judean villages suddenly become cities. Social and religious struggles, which would occur with a large influx of population, aren't mentioned by the Bible, and Finkelstein and Silberman argue that the priests of Jerusalem began to promote Yahweh-based monotheism, and they aligned themselves with King Hezekiah's anti-Assyrian views because they thought that Assyrian domination of Israel would cause social injustice, or perhaps they wanted to gain political or economic control over the newly wealthy countryside. Now let me jump ahead to what the Bible on Earth says about King Josiah, because they argue that he's the one that really puts together the Old Testament and the founding myths of the Jewish people as we know them today. King Josiah is recorded to have ruled from 641 or 640 to 610, 609 BC, and Josiah enacted a large number of religious reforms after he became king. This is after the Assyrian exile, but before the Babylonian exile. The Temple of Jerusalem is renovated. The high priest is recorded to have found a scroll of the law, which insists on monotheism, with sacrifice at a centralized temple in Jerusalem. So Finkelstein and Silberman note that most scholars regard the core of Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, as being the scroll of the law in question, and they think that it wasn't written long before it was found. Rather, it was an ancient missing scroll as characterized in the Bible. What they would say is Deuteronomy is claimed to have been rediscovered in the 7th century, and it goes back to the 13th or 14th century. It would be like if a politician today claimed to have found a document from Thomas Jefferson that radically reinterprets the Constitution, but it has references to email in it. So with those anachronistic statements, you know that it's not authentic. And these critics of the traditional Old Testament account would say that this statement in Josiah's time that he claims to be going back to Deuteronomy has lots of anachronisms there. It's full of 7th century BC statements, not 12th or 13th century BC statements. And it resembles Assyrian vassal treaties that are set out the rights and obligations of a vassal state to their sovereign. The vassal state is Judah, and the sovereign in this case is Yahweh. So Josiah imposed this scroll as the new religious orthodoxy, and he destroys old cult centers. He even goes so far as to slaughter the priests of the shrines, burn their bodies, and bury their bones in the tombs near them on old altars. The collapse of the Assyrian Empire in the last decades of the 7th century BC gives Josiah opportunities to expand Judah's territory in the former kingdom of Israel abandoned by the Assyrians. So it's now that the author of Deuteronomy, working in Josiah's court, reworks older legends, texts,